All right, hello. So today we're going to be looking at Mr. Foucault. In the last few videos, I've been talking about the different philosophical foundations of idealism and materialism, and I spoke about kind of like different ways of understanding what each of those are, and then I did a little bit of comparison between the two. And today we're going to be looking at an example of a historian, a philosopher of history. Ultimately, that's what Foucault is. That's really what he is trying to do in like his most ambitious attempts. Um, like Foucault is also like we associate him as like it being part of like some kind of radical tradition of philosophy. He's like a radical philosopher. He's trying to like fight back against power. He's trying to conceive and of power in such a way that you can like use it to criticize like dominant modes of power. But my argument, and I've spoken about this many times in many different places, is that Foucault, for all his empiricism, he does a lot of like archival work and looks a lot at in his books he talks a lot about like empirical phenomena, but ultimately he is an idealist, and that comes down to his conception of power knowledge, which is really, it comes to be like the dominant concepts in his philosophy, and it's how he conceives of history as like a unified body. It's like the concept that he uses to think about history as such. So for Foucault, you have power, knowledge. You have these two concepts that are in a kind of like dialectical relationship where one is informing the other. Knowledge is moving forward. It's moving power forward. It's affecting the ways that power builds its structures of control or whatever. And like those structures of power, those institutions of power are in turn determining how and what kind of knowledge is produced. That in itself is not an uncontroversial claim. Like, we should all think that is true. Like, certainly power and knowledge have a mutually informing relationship. That is, fine. But the problem comes in when he starts using that conception to talk about history as a whole in a more abstract sense, which he does. Like, you kind of have to talk about, you need some kind of concept that can connect like different historical periods, vastly different historical periods, and like talk about what is the same between them, and also talk about like what is the motivating force for history as a whole. And for Foucault, that is power knowledge. So famously in his book, I think it's Discipline and Punish, he talks about this move around the turn of the 17th century, I believe, from the sovereign mode, where you have like the king or the ruler or whatever, who exercises their power over the bodies of the subjects in a kind of one-to-one relationship. Like the king has like absolute power over life and death. The king can say, but like the manner in which the king exercises power is pretty inefficient in that way, because like he needs to like go to the subject and kill them, or not, or choose to allow them to live. But then, like with increases in population, there needed to be like a more efficient way of distributing power, which is how you get the move into the disciplinary mode of power, which is famously summed up in the Panopticon, where you don't even really need any disciplinarian to be present exercising power, because the building itself is disciplinarian. Like, you just put a bunch of people in these cells, and the way the Panopticon is set up, is like they do the work themselves. They internalize power, they internalize the discipline, and that's all well and good. But when you talk about these two different historical periods and like what it is that connects them, what it is that like causes one historical period to turn into another historical period. And Foucault talks about like many different historical periods. He talks about ancient Greece, for example. So like what is it that connects ancient Greece to like the monarchical period to like the contemporary modern period of discipline and punishment? And you need like that is where power knowledge becomes like a kind of a metaphysical concept, and it's not just about like how like the various institutions that it has become concretized in, and like Foucault talks in those terms explicitly. He speaks he talks about how like the things that he's studying, for example the panopticon, is really just like a residue of power. It is something that power has left behind. So what is it? What is this power thing? Like it becomes a metaphysical concept, and doing metaphysics is not in itself a bad thing. You can do materialist metaphysics, as we've learned from the example of Democritus and Epicurus. I should talk more about those guys, but like metaphysics is not wrong in itself. It's when you start doing idealist metaphysics that it becomes a problem. And that's precisely what Foucault does with his concept of power, because like he is really he wants there, and rightly so, he wants to have some kind of concept that is able to connect all these different historical periods, that is able to account for the movement of history itself. But he also wants, because he's like a very opposed to totalitarianism, which is just a complete fucking bullshit made up concept, at least when he applies it to Marxism. But he's very opposed to totalitarianism, right? So he wants to see all of these historical periods as discontinuous in a sense, and yet they are still connected because they are still part of history, and history has this like through line throughout it. I mean, we're talking about, if we just talk about like the history of the universe, the through line is going to be physics. If we're talking about the history of human society, what is that through line going to be? It's going to be, for Foucault, power, which becomes an idealist concept. I'm not sure if I'm really making this clear, but for Foucault, like, power becomes idealist because he wants it to be something like I'll just it's easier to understand if we use a contrasting opinion. So for Marx, which is like the best account of history, the common element of all these different historical periods is that they are all made out of atoms. The motivating force of history is class struggle, but in more metaphysical terms, it is matter. Like everything that has ever happened in human society throughout all of history, it's connected because they're all made out of the same substance, which is matter. So it is atoms and void, which is like what connects atoms. That is, that is what is moving throughout history. That is what is causing things to move forward. But for Foucault, he does it like that is too totalitarian because it gives it presents history as continuous rather than discontinuous. It gives one kind of account. You're able to understand all of these different things in a single term. But for him, that is totalitarian. That forces difference under the same heading. So power is this concept, it's this force, it is like some kind of being that exists in the form of institutions like the panopticon, like concretions in the world, um, like it leaves behind residue, like that we can look at empirically, like again the panopticon, but like power as such exists separately from them, and it needs to, in order for there to be, for human history to make sense, for us to be even able to talk about human history. So in order for him to, like, one, talk about history as like a coherent body, and then two, be able to talk about that as composed of discontinuous epochs or moments or whatever, he needs to come up with a concept, power, that is able to unify everything, but which at the same time is abstract enough that it doesn't become totalitarian. It doesn't, force everything. It doesn't force difference under the same heading. It doesn't like exert violence or whatever, however the hell he phrases it. So that is why power is an idealist concept. Foucault, famous empiricist, basically like a glorified bookworm who like spent all of his time in the archives, like looking at old court documents and whatnot, who's so focused on empirical data and like connecting them all. Ultimately, his concept of history is idealist because of this concept of power, which really it doesn't find any, it cannot be located in the world, like the residue that it leaves behind, like the sovereign mode and all of its apparatuses, like the soldiers that the sovereign used to exercise its power in that period, and then in the contemporary period, the panopticon and these other kind of disciplinary apparatuses, those are really just residue. Those are things that have been left behind by something that exists somewhere else in some more like universal sense. So yeah, I feel like this. Is that all I wanted to say? I mean, that is my somewhat inept attempt to argue for why specifically Foucault is an idealist, and it's contained in that concept of power specifically. Like the relationship between power and knowledge is fine. We can all get on board with that. It's kind of already within Marxism. That's another important thing. Like everything that Foucault did well, and that he did good, all of like the good things that Foucault has to offer are already contained within Marxism. So we don't need him, and we should not use him because his philosophy is idealist. So you have this concept of power, which is some kind of being that exists outside of time. It's immaterial. It cannot be located in the physical universe. It can only be like traced in the form of its concretions, in the form of its residue, which again, these are the terms that Foucault himself uses. And why is that bad? I mean, I think I've spoken enough about that, and I think I've spoken enough for this video, so I'll see you next time.